Okay, I guess we're supposed to start. So I want to put globalization in historic perspective, talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going. And I guess it would be useful to start with a definition. What are we talking about when we talk about globalization? And I think the way economists approach it is that it refers to the increased integration of economies around the world. And that integration can be along the dimensions of trade in goods and services. It can be along the dimensions of increased capital flows and direct investment, both short-term and long-term capital flows across countries. So capital, goods trading. It also can be migration, long-term or short-term migration, guest workers, or migration from one country to another. So it involves labor mobility as well. So it's not just the movement of goods and services, it's the movement of capital, the movement of labor, but also the movement of technology and ideas. And so that's something that's a little more intangible, but very important. You know, many of us have laptops, we all have smartphones, and so there's a lot of apps, so there's a lot of things that are moving across countries that are not physical things. And also culture. So culture goes across country boundaries too. And so this is something we talked about yesterday, we didn't talk about trade and goods so much, but we talked about culture and how that impacts our values. And the person that came up the most was this person. I think you can recognize her. Does everyone know who she is? Taylor Swift. I had the privilege of seeing her in concert more than 10 years ago. I didn't on the most recent one because my two daughters dragged me to it. I was very lucky. It was worthwhile. She puts on a fantastic show, and she's just learned to do it better and better. So if you ever have that opportunity to go see her. It made a big impression on me. I'm not sure I have any deep thoughts about how she or other people in Hollywood affect values across countries, but I did write an article for the student newspaper at Dartmouth, my college where I teach. And so if you Google Douglas Irwin, Taylor Swift, Dartmouth, you'll bring this up. And actually what I do is I take her lyrics and apply it to the concept of globalization and trade. So all the things we were talking about last time in terms of trade, Taylor Swift speaks to these ideas of international trade to some extent. Or so I made it up. But at any rate, that is out there. What is this building here? How many have you visited? If you're local, not, but have you had a chance to visit? Okay, so I highly recommend it. This is something that Larry White and I did the other day, and it is the Louvre Art Museum here in Abu Dhabi, about 10 minutes away that way or so. It's a fantastic building, a fantastic collection. And what struck me and Larry is that there's a lot of economics in the building and a lot of trade. And of course, the collections go way back. So what does this say? This is one of the first exhibits. It says trade in the Gulf. Trade and other exchanges in the Gulf flourished greatly between 2500 and 1700 BCE. That's a long time ago. So human beings have been trading for as long as human beings have been on this earth. And I think there were probably capital flows back then, certainly labor migration. So this idea of globalization is not new. It goes way back to the beginning of mankind. And you can see it here in the museum. And of course, one of the big trade networks that flourished around the world in BC times and thereafter was the Roman Empire. And what the Roman Empire did was provide sort of, it was sort of an early European Union in a way. It provided a common framework for economic activity in which capital and labor and goods and services could flow between not just Rome, but all around Europe into the Middle East. There was quite a lot of economic activity, and a lot of it has been documented at the Louvre and other museums. Have you ever seen the blasphemous movie from Monty Python, Life of Brian? There's a wonderful scene in there. If you don't see it, you can Google this as well, where John Cleese, have you ever heard of John Cleese and Monty Python? Okay, he's in Palestine, and he's complaining about the Roman Empire, because this is imperialism, right? Rome is dominating the whole world. And he's saying, they oppress us, They take us for granted. What have they ever done for us? And he and his comrades who are trying to overthrow Roman rule start thinking about all the things Rome had done for them. And they come up with this list. Well, sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, fresh water system, public health. But aside from that, what have the Romans ever done for us? And that's the common complaint. Actually, it turns out Rome did do a lot for this whole region in terms of providing stability and allowing a lot of economic activity to take place, which is why we have all these artifacts in various museums. And historians, not economic historians per se, have gone back and looked at, well, what happened when Rome fell? And it turns out we don't have GDP statistics for this period. We don't have industrial production and employment, but we do have artifacts, pottery, information on trade routes, and there was a calamitous collapse in all of these things when the Roman Empire fell. In other words, when there was a disintegration of what was then the world economy, it had big impacts on standard of living. And once again, archaeologists, through digging various sites, have seen there's an utter absence of pottery around the year 500 or 600. The trade networks seem to have dried up. And Brian Ward Perkins, who's a historian and archaeologist at Oxford, he's written a lot on this, on economic decline in the whole world between about, say, 400, 500, up to about 700 or 800 BCE, after modern period. And what he says is that when it happened, it led to a dramatic simplification in production and exchange, a remarkable regression in material culture. The large Roman middle and lower market for high-quality basic goods was substantially destroyed, and with it went commercial activity and specialization. So what this is saying is that when there was a geopolitical fragmentation, when politics was such that Europe was no longer integrated, there were huge economic consequences. Now, what you can tell is that maybe I'm leading to a theme here, which is not that the world is going to go in this direction, but the world is changing. The nature of globalization is changing, not so much because of the economics, but because of the politics. And the lesson here is that when you have political fragmentation, it has economic consequences, and it can lead to economic decline. So things picked up after that in Europe, and once again, you can go to the Louvre and you'll see displays that will talk about globalization in this period. So this is the first globalization. The unprecedented acceleration between the 1500s and 1700s, exchanges across all continents brought a profound transformation to societies and territories. So after the end of the Roman Empire, it took a while, but the world economy began to come back. This can be documented with documents, archaeological evidence, and what have you. Then if you move through the Louvre a little bit further, there's another display, another room towards the modern world. It says, by way of established global trade networks, affluence was no longer exclusively the privilege of monarchs, but was now increasingly attainable by a large segment of society, the middle class. They're talking about the year 1700 or so. And these colonial empires and the expansion of trade. This is also going to foretell a little bit what we have just seen in the world over the past 3 decades. The spread of prosperity as a result of trade and integration. Okay, so this is what the Louvre is talking about. We actually have data going back to the 1500s on world trade. It's very crude evidence, but this is globalization over 5 centuries. And what you can see here is, depending on the high or low estimates, about up to about 10%, at maximum 10% of world GDP was engaged in trade. So what this is an index of is the sum of world exports and imports divided by world GDP. Once again, all these numbers are very vague and imprecise, but you can see there's this uptick between 1500 and 1800 in world commerce. But of course, what happens after 1800? What do you think happens to this? Industrialization, and boom! Look at this. This is astounding. So there's this break, but then there's up, down. But recently, it's just soared. So the world has really become much more integrated than it ever was in terms of what the museums say. in terms of where we were in the past. And so what I want to do is sort of blow up and focus on this modern period and explain a little bit about what happens and what is happening now and why the nature of globalization is changing. So just to sort of highlight what I want to do over the next 45 minutes or an hour or so, is stress to you that we are coming off a remarkable period in human history in terms of the globalization we've had. You know, we sort of think we're not, you know, we sort of take for granted what has been going on in the world. It's just sort of happening. But what has happened over the past 30 years is of historic consequence. But, there's always a but, the past drivers, the last 30 years, those drivers of globalization have stalled. There's a return of geopolitics. It's not like the fall of the Roman Empire where the whole world economy is going to fragment, but we're moving a little bit in that direction. And to understand where we are today, we have to appreciate where we've been. So I want to put the last 30 years in historical context and then talk about sort of where the world may be going. Okay, so here's this modern period from about 1870 right up to the present. And what I think is we've had is 5 globalization periods, 5 globalization eras. And they're sort of marked here. And they sort of account for the ups and downs and the fluctuations in this chart. Once again, what is this chart? It's measured just that one aspect of globalization, trade as a share of GDP. How much of world output is being traded? So it's not looking at capital flows so much, it's not looking at labor migration. A lot of them are highly correlated with this, but they're not measured in exactly the same way. So the first period is the late 19th century, right up to about 1914 or so. And you can see slowly rising degrees of integration. So what was going on during this period? From your studies, colonization, yep. Pardon me? The cotton textile industry. So industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, it's a little bit, started earlier in the century, but that was accelerating, reducing the cost of producing manufactured goods.
Steam engines, ships.
Ships. So technology is changing. And you're exactly right. And here's one picture that sort of summarizes exactly what all these things we're talking about. So we have a factory here, so the rise of factories. Instead of people having to produce their own clothing in their own village, in households, you now have big factories that can produce it much cheaper. The railroad, okay? Great innovation for reducing costs and integrating markets. What is this here? Pardon me? The telegraph. So now information can travel. The transatlantic cable was laid in the 1860s, linking London and New York in terms of financial markets and information, political news and what have you. What else do we see here? Obviously machinery. And so this sort of summarizes a lot of what was going on. It's called the progress of the century. So a lot of these innovations were sort of hitting in the late 19th century. And we actually, we can do photographs too. That's a new innovation. So people are moving. Mass migration from Europe to the Americas. And so I think these might be some people from Italy. And there are 2 boats leaving Italy. And you could go to either New York City or Buenos Aires. Because at the time, Argentina was one of the richest economies in the world, had very high wages, but it turns out the fortunes of the United States and Argentina diverged thereafter. So fate is sort of picked, depending on which boat you took, steamships, telegraphs, and things like that. All these things were working towards more integration. What stopped this integration? World War I. So just as the Roman Empire sort of hit a limit when there were invasions from the Visigoths and others, the destruction of Europe during World War I, wars are not good for commerce, not good for investment. They disrupt trade flows and what have you, and so there's this disintegration process. So this is 1914. The recovery from the war was very difficult. So there's the Versailles peace and what have you, but there's obviously Reconstruction. The 1920s, booming, roaring 20s in the United States, but still difficult recovery in Europe. What happened in the 1930s?
Great Depression.
The Great Depression. Okay, so we have war, we have a difficult recovery, then we have the Great Depression. And so what you can see is there's a period here, a 30-year period, where global integration, there's trying to come back after the war, but then all these other shocks that are pushing things down. So there's disintegration in the global economy. They tried to reconstruct the gold standard. They did it in a very poor way, and it sort of malfunctioned. They couldn't restore trade ties the way they had before, and what have you. The U.S. also contributed this with a policy mistake. Has anyone heard of the Smoot-Hawley tariff? Okay, maybe, yes.
Is it the tariff on wine in the 50s?
Not just on wine, on most goods. So the U.S. basically raised its tariff level the legislation was initially passed in 1929, 1930. The stock market also crashed in 1929. And this is the act. Those are the members of Congress that introduced this legislation to raise tariffs as the world economy was in this rather fragile state. A lot of economists, over 1,000 economists, requested that the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, they thought he should reject that bill, but he didn't. He signed it. It led to retaliation, something we've also seen recently. Whenever the U.S. raises tariffs, a lot of other countries retaliate, so it started a trade war. Canada raised tariffs against the U.S., Western European countries. So just as we're in this fragile equilibrium, we have a trade war started. And I've written a book sort of on this whole thing, on the relationship between the Smoot-Hawley and the Great Depression, but it was just not a good development for the world economy. And what happened is, and it wasn't just because of the trade war, there are a lot of other factors going on, there's this downward spiral of world trade. And this is sort of a neat chart, shows month by month, starting in 1929, 30, 31, 32, 33, every consecutive month, there's just trade is going down, 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 down. Now, partly it's because of demand, the huge shock with the Great Depression, but the trade war is on top of this, and a lot of other factors too. So this is, once again, not integration, this is disintegration. And so it was not a good time for the world economy. In fact, the Great Depression was the largest trade shock we've ever sort of observed in terms of the decline in trade, largely because of demand. These are all the other periods. But notice, so the volume of world trade fell by 25% over these 3 or 4 years. Half of it has been attributed to protectionism. That is, of course, with declining demand, trade is going to fall. But it was 25, half of this is due to the restriction of trade across countries due to the movement towards protectionism. So the big contrast, and this is exactly what Tyler was speaking about, these two big shocks. We also had big declines in trade, but notice very short periods of time. It wasn't prolonged like 3 or 4 years. This is the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Trade fell by more than 10%, but very little of it was due to protectionism. Because we had agreements in place, international institutions in place like the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to limit how much countries could pile on trade restrictions. And of course, COVID, also protectionism didn't play a role, is more just the shock of declining economic activity. But obviously, this is sort of a big dislocator in terms of trade. If that was not enough, the Great Depression, of course, we have another war. And this is even more of a worldwide war, World War II, Asia, Middle East, Europe, everywhere. Obviously, that's not a good thing for world trade as well. So if we go back just to look, well, we can just see here, we're reaching by the 1940s pretty low levels of integration back to where we were in the 1870s or even beforehand. So all these forces acting to pull the world economy apart, not good for standards of living or people's welfare. So here's where the U.S., which after World War I had was not engaged in global affairs very much, was isolationist. The U.S. stepped up and said, we just fought 2 world wars. We cannot afford to fight World War III. Why not? What would be the problem with a World War III? We have the atomic bomb now. We have nuclear weapons. So that's going to be even more destructive. So we have to make sure that we avoid another war. We cannot do so without ensuring that the world economy is on a solid footing. Because if there's still conflict over trade and resources and what have you, it's just going to lead to another conflict. So, as Franklin Roosevelt said, we cannot succeed in building a peaceful world unless we build an economically healthy world. So there's a huge effort at the time to build international institutions to bring the world together through the United Nations, through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to try to get cooperation rather than the problems that we'd had before. And so I'll talk just a little bit about the trade aspect of this. President Roosevelt died in 1945. President Truman took over, but he continued this agenda. And he made this statement before the US led some trade negotiations, where he said that at this time, the thought and energy of the world is of obtaining the objectives of peace and freedom. Okay, what also happened in the 1930s? Politically in Europe? Fascism, then we had communism in the Soviet Union, so democracy was really taking a hit too. So both the world economy was shrinking and we had a political repression. So peace and freedom. No more wars, and we want political freedom. These objectives are bound up with a third objective, the reestablishment of world trade. In fact, the three, peace, freedom, and world trade, are inseparable. The grave lessons of the past have proved it. And that's the lesson that he and other US policymakers took from the 1930s, that these things are linked together. Truman Doctrine was a little bit different. Yes, that we want, like Marshall Plan aid, we're going to oppose the expansion of communism, things of that sort. Yeah. So he made that statement right before the US started these negotiations leading to something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was just a simple agreement to not tell countries what their trade policy ought to be, but to set rules for trade and to start negotiating the reduction in trade barriers. And so have you heard of the GATT before? Okay. Some people call it the General Agreement to Talk and Talk, because it sounds like they're sort of all getting along and talking, but well, these negotiations take a long time. And there's a phrase that all these members from different countries. This is a small meeting. It's now grown to the WTO, where it's more than 160 countries, and there's a lot of talking going on. Not much action, but at this early stage, they got some action. But once again, I talked about this yesterday. Remember this idea that why do we care about freer trade? Maybe it has good political benefits. It leads to peace. Whether you believe that or not, that's what people believed at the time. So this is a stamp in the United States saying world peace through trade. And once again, it's reflecting on the 1930s when there was this economic disintegration and higher tariffs. We want to reverse that. And here's a political cartoon that sort of illustrates the mindset of the US during this period. So here we have trade freedom, and it's supporting political cooperation, and that's supporting world peace, which is sort of the ultimate objective. But what do we have here? We have a problem. We have tariff lobbies. What is a tariff lobbyist? Protection. So it's a special interest group. It's a domestic producer that wants to keep out foreign competition. And what is it doing? This is a straw that's shooting something, peas, at trade freedom. So it's trying to disrupt trade freedom. It doesn't want these negotiations because they don't want to be exposed to foreign competition. Well, the idea was if you disturb trade freedom, you're going to lead to a collapse here. So the idea was we need to overcome the protectionist interests and just try to secure a safer, more peaceful, more prosperous world. Because politicians, in some sense, I think they recognize will be more prosperous with trade, but they have these domestic groups telling them, don't trade. You're hurting us. We'll have more jobs at home if you stop trade. So that is this third period here. I call this the GATT era. It's a rebound from where we had been with the depths of the 1920s and 30s and the Great Depression and what have you. And it took us almost back to where we were before World War I. But notice there's many decades after World War I, so we're just getting back to where we were. But it was sort of limited. Why was it limited? Because the world was still fragmented. So you've heard the term third world. This term doesn't really get used much anymore, but back in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, there were sort of three worlds. The GATT applied mainly to the blue countries, the first world, What was the GATT? It only had 23 countries initially. It was mainly the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, and a few other countries. So this agreement to reduce tariffs, it didn't apply to the world. It applied to, basically Western Europe and North America and a few other countries. So it's very limited. So this recovery here, it's very limited because the reduction in trade barriers was very limited in terms of its geographic coverage. The second world, what was the second world? That's in red. That's the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, Vietnam, a few other places. That's the communist bloc. Did they believe in free trade? Were they highly integrated? Did they want foreign investment coming in? No, they were planned economies. And again, this gets back to what Larry was talking about yesterday. Free trade does not work with planned economies. It disrupts the plan. So there was not a lot of trade between the East and the West. Obviously some, a little bit. It's not zero, it's not autarky, but it's really limited. What about the third world? Africa, Latin America, South Asia. They were non-aligned. They didn't decide between East and West. And they wanted to industrialize. They wanted to become richer. They were relatively poor. And so they thought, I'd say erroneously, that the way to get rich is to limit trade and build up your own manufacturing industries. And so they pursued something called import substitution. Why should we import steel when we can produce it ourselves? Why should we import cars when we can produce it ourselves? So we want to have our own car industry. We want to have our own steel industry. We want to have our own textile industry. And the way you do that is raise trade barriers. So they didn't participate in the GATT. They didn't reduce their trade barriers. They remained sort of isolated. So the world economy was very fragmented in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Okay, so that's why this integration, it didn't really go very far. Yes, the US and Western Europe, but it wasn't part of the whole world. But then things really began to change in the 1980s, 90s, and the 2000s. So what happened? Two things. Well, first of all, if there's more trade, why do you think there's more trade? The cost of doing trade went down. Well, why did the cost of trade go down? It could be just the physical cost of transporting goods, or it could be trade barriers, and maybe they're going to come down as well. In fact, so we had two things here pushing globalization. Lower trade costs coming about because of transport costs and declining trade barriers. So I'll say a little bit of each. And I'll sort of talk about this because this is the last few decades that we've been living in, and this is what I think is changing. So just transport costs, if we look at them between 1965 and 2014, you can see they've fallen 30% or more, depending on how you calculate it. So if transport costs are falling 30%, it's actually sort of a small fraction of the price of goods delivered, but that's still pretty significant. That's allowing more integration to take place. So how could we illustrate this? How could we see the decline in transportation costs? Well, let's think about trade in cars. There's been trade in cars for a long time. This is how you used to offload cars from ships. In terms of Italy sending Fiats to the US, or the US exporting Fords. What do you notice about this? Pardon me? Oh, okay, not safe. Yep. One car at a time. How much labor is involved here? Well, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 people for 4 or 5 cars. So one by one. So it's laborious. It's pretty costly. How do we trade cars today? Not containers. They're not put in containers, but there's huge ships just devoted to one thing, moving cars. And you're going to put thousands of cars on these ships, move at once. You just drive them off. It's not loading them one at a time. It's really efficient, and the cost per car is pretty low because you can put a lot of cars in these things. Of course, what's the risk? Okay, so Kia lost 3,000 cars when its ship was misloaded and it tipped over in a storm or something like that. Okay, so that's the risk. Now try to write this thing. That's going to be a tough thing to do. So yes, there's efficiencies, but things can also go wrong sometimes. Oh, okay, insurance will pay, right? Yeah. Well, say that to the Kia managers who I'm not sure that was good enough. Okay, so that's cars, but also think about basic commodities. How did we used to, Middle East used to export oil? You know, what the prices per barrel of oil. Well, that's sort of an inefficient way to move oil. It's an efficient way of moving flour. And so you have bags of corn or wheat, barrels of this or that or what have you. And of course, you know how we do this today, right? That's the container ships, okay? So you just stuff the containers with various things, and these can be not easily offloaded. You know, this is, I think, in the United States, but you know, just look around the coast here, right? Big ports. How many people are involved in taking off these containers? Not six people physically moving, just one crane operator, and you could even probably get rid of the crane operator because now it's all electronic. They have semiconductors, we talked about that, that would sort of know which container is going where, put directly on a railroad, directly on a bed of a truck, and go off to its destination. So the efficiency here is just incredible. And if you're interested in learning more about just how this one innovation sort of helped transform the world economy, there's a nice book, which is actually, I went to the bookstore in the Galleria. They have it. So you can run over and get their one copy. It's called The Box by Mark Levinson. And it's really a fascinating story about this one little innovation that changed so much. Of course, what's the problem with containers and container ships is the containers can fall overboard sometimes. So there's this famous incident where a whole container of little yellow rubber ducks was pitched overboard, broke open. They lost their cargo, but for oceanographers, it was a tremendous boon because they could track where the duckies were going all around the world. And 10 years later, after this incident, they were still washing up on the shore of Western Europe through the Northwest Passage. And so, South America broke open on the Pacific. The ducks went everywhere. And there's a whole book about this, too, called Moby Duck. It's not at the Galleria, unfortunately. You might have to order it on Amazon. But you can learn about how the ducks went around the world. Oh, really? Duck competition. So what do they do with?
They have a huge amount of yellow ducks. They put this two drops in the sea. They put numbers for every participant that they throw the ducks. Whose duck reaches first, they're gonna win.
I see. Okay. Yes. So maybe it was inspired by this accident of the cargo container falling overboard. Of course, other things can happen too. You might remember this. This happened not too long ago or too far away. A container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal and blocked traffic for about 2 weeks. And this is a huge thing in international trade. And it was riveting the world about how are we going to unstuck this thing. You might say, how could this possibly happen? You know, you just drive a boat up this canal. Well, the New York Times on their website had a little video game of driving a ship up the Suez Canal. And that's actually harder than you think, because there actually is a current. It's not just as calm as you think. And the ship, it's a challenge. It's not, maneuvering through these things is difficult. And of course, here it was blocked right down there. It meant traffic was stopped up and down the canal. 13% of world trade goes through the Suez Canal. So that's a big chunk of world trade that you're blocking. And of course, we saw this yesterday, you might recall. What happened to Suez Canal in the 1960s and 70s? Exactly. Egypt closed it for a number of years, 10 years or something like that, or a little less than that. And so, the alternative route is to go around the Cape of Good Hope. Egypt wasn't prepared for this. So this is how they tried to get it unstuck initially. That wasn't going to work. So now, hopefully, if another ship gets stuck, they're aware you just can't use a backhoe to sort of dig it out. You got to take bigger measures than that. Of course, there's not just this innovation in terms of container ships, but there's also air transport too. That's another innovation of the last 20 or 30 years. So air cargo, you have two major airports here. I would hazard a guess that only about half the flights are passenger flights. A lot of the other flights are cargo flights. There's whole airports in the US where passengers don't go, it's just for cargo. And it's pretty amazing. So the US sells cows to China, shipped on 747 jets. They don't put them on ships. It's so valuable, it's worth putting them on an airplane and flying them, for 10 hours or whatever to China. And so
Business class or coach?
it's not, I think they're all cattle class. Maybe they just call it cattle class. So they, these jets, they don't have any seats in them. They rip out all the seats, so it's just you put in whatever cargo you have. That's how we get our iPhones, at least in the United States. They don't put them on a ship and wait for 2 or 3 weeks. Maybe the ship sinks or something like that and loses all the air. They want things fast. So you just put them on a plane and you go. Have you ever seen this plane? You have. Tell me about it. Well, there are big transport planes, but this is not one of them. This is an Airbus plane, and it's designed for one purpose only. First of all, here it is, the Airbus Beluga. Yeah. Exactly. This carries other planes. Airbus only has about 5 of them, and they just put other plane parts into them. Why do they do that? So here is the fuselage of an A350 or something like that going into this Airbus Beluga. Here's the tail fin of an A380 for Singapore Airlines going into the Airbus Beluga. Why do they do this? This is the fragmentation of production, where once again, what did we say yesterday? Specialization and trade. So specialization, there are firms and plants in Western Europe that just do fuselages, that just do the tail fin, that just do the landing gear. And then they take all these parts, like the iPhone is not made anywhere, it's all these parts that are just assembled. Well, that's what they do in Toulouse. In Toulouse, they put together the Airbus jets. But they get the fuselage in one place, the wings from someplace, the tail fins from elsewhere, the cockpit from somewhere else, and then they all bring it. Now, Toulouse is inland, and there may be some politics here because it's not necessarily the most efficient place to produce things, but it's not a port, you can't ship things into Toulouse. You can't put the stuff on railroad beds because they're so enormous, so you have to fly it in. The Airbus Beluga is designed to fly it in. Boeing does the same thing. They have the Dreamliner, Dreamlifter. This is bigger than a 747. It's just to move parts for Boeing to assemble in Washington State or elsewhere. But what do all these things do? Pardon me? Yes. What they do is reducing the costs of moving goods means you can fragment production, you get more trade, more specialization, greater division of labor. And the Airbus, the Dreamliner opens sort of sideways, the fuselage, not the front opening up. So it's a little bit different. And of course, we talked about the iPhone last time. Air transport has just allowed all these parts to come in. So it's parts from Japan, Germany, Korea, and et cetera like that. So what we've seen is just a revolution in the way goods move across countries over the past 30 years or so doing those things. But it wouldn't have happened. It wouldn't have happened if countries kept trade barriers high. If China had really high tariffs on cows, it wouldn't pay to put them on a 747 and fly them from the United States to China, because you'd have to pay a big tax. So the other thing that's happened that's encouraged this integration and supply chain networks is declining trade barriers. And that's because many countries have unilaterally decided to reduce their trade barriers in a way that they hadn't before. So this is a chart I showed last time, but I didn't really explain it. What this is just counting the number of countries that are undertaking big changes in their trade policy to open up. How much opening was there in the 60s? Not much. How about the 70s? Not much. But right around 1985 or so, in the early 90s, a lot of countries all started doing the same thing, is opening up. So what happened in this year right here? The Berlin Wall fell. So what happened? Collapse of the Soviet Union. So Eastern Europe, which sort of always wanted to naturally trade with Western Europe, they were free to choose their own trade regime, their own political regime, and what have you, and they moved towards democracy and freer markets. And the transition from?
Two superpowers to one superpower.
Exactly. So geopolitics changed. China opened up, so that's 1978 or so, and a bunch of other countries did as well. So you have this wave of liberalization. In Latin America, they said, you know, we've tried this import substitution policy of building up our own industry. It's not really working. We're not growing more rapidly. Maybe we ought to adopt freer trade policy. So all around the world, there's sort of this wave. And so the advanced countries, Western Europe, United States, and what have you, already had pretty low tariffs that they were bringing them down. But the developing countries, they had really high tariffs, 30%. We talked about tax rates. There's another tax on trade, and these taxes started coming down. If you tax something less, you're going to get more of it. And so that led to this acceleration in trade. They're still higher, but they've converged to some extent. And so the whole world changed between 1985 and 1995. In 1985, the world was fragmented, 3 worlds, they're not really well integrated. 1995, basically every country is a member of the WTO. Every country is moved towards more market-oriented status. And it's sort of one world. And so you don't have to worry about political boundaries anymore. All of a sudden there's a flow of investment into China, whereas there'd never been any investment under Mao's China. Yes?
How about, you know, there was also an important event in the early 70s.
There was also what?
Important event in the early 70s, which was the detachment of the dollar from gold.
Yep.
How would you integrate this into this whole phenomenon?
Nope. Almost no impact on world trade.
Sorry, can you repeat that one?
Oh, yeah. The question is, in 1971, the Bretton Woods system collapsed. We went off the gold standard in some sense. The dollar was detached from gold. It led to higher inflation, but that's just a nominal thing. World trade continued apace.
What I said is, I asked Doug if, you know, the important event occurred in, I guess, 71, which was the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, detachment of dollar from gold, and also an increase in the price of oil over that decade of about 5-6 times.
Yep. That was a huge negative supply shock to the world, the oil shock. That's different than the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. They're really separate events. Maybe they're related in some indirect way. But that actually increased trade in the short run because countries had to pay for their oil and so had to boost their exports as a result of that. So it didn't really change. We'll go back. I'll show you that fluctuations. It actually it didn't change all that much. So what I'm saying is this one decade between 85 and 95, the whole world changed. Yeah.
You were talking about trade barriers between countries. In Israel, for instance, there's safety standards that you can have the European standard, but there's also an Israeli one. And that adds sometimes some products that might be okay in Europe might not be okay in Israel. Do you think there should be a global safety standard for everything, or should every country have the right to actually have their safety standards in order to make sure their citizens are safer?
Well, there's a trade-off there. Every country wants sovereignty and wants to have its own standards, but then the cost is that if you're a small market, no one's going to sell to you because it's really expensive to tailor your products to meet those particular standards. So that's why countries like Morocco and others will sign agreements with the European Union saying, let's harmonize these standards. And so actually that's where trade negotiations have gone in some sense. It used to be about these taxes, these tariffs. But once you get the tariffs way down, then you're absolutely right. It's regulation that's the issue. And then how do you have regulatory standards that will meet the needs of businesses and allow these markets to continue to integrate and flourish. Yeah. So what I want to do is tell you a few stories about different countries and how they opened up and how it revolutionized the world and has changed where we are today. So if we go back to, let's see, there's a country here, let's focus on this one right here. One country, 1966 or 67, Korea. Okay, what was the impact of Korea's opening? So President Park Chung-hee, they have a crisis, won't get into all the details. He says we need to increase trade, we need to boost exports. And so they set this goal of $1 billion, which at the time was considered a far reach. How could this small country, poor country, ever possibly reach $1 billion in exports? This is the way Seoul, Korea looked in 1960. It was one of the poorest countries in the world, much poorer than West Africa. It had been devastated by World War II, the Korean War, but also it was not exactly rich before that. It was an incredibly poor place. How do you think Seoul looks today? This is the same river in downtown Seoul. This is in the span of not your lifetime, but my lifetime. So it's within a generation and a half. This is remarkable. This is why it's known as the Korean miracle. There are a lot of miracles out there. This is actually a color picture taken in 1965 by a USAID official in Seoul, Korea. What are the people doing there? Washing clothes. What does Korea sell to the world today? Washing machines. Does anyone wash their clothes in the river anymore? No, they have a washing machine. In fact, Korea is exporting washing machines. If you buy a washing machine in the United States, there's about a 1/3 to 1/2 chance it's made in Korea. So that's a remarkable transformation. And of course, here is Seoul today. And I mentioned this last time that as late as 1970, it wasn't clear which country was richer, North Korea or South Korea. Okay, because they're both pretty poor. But by opening up to trade, what is the biggest gain from trade I tried to suggest yesterday? Peace, of course, yes, but it's not a direct consequence of trade. That's a part of it.
Efficiency.
You're gaining efficiency, but what is it that you can import? That knowledge and ideas, technology. Okay, that's transformative, and that's why you get this break. So yes, if you trade more, you can buy more oranges and bananas. You can have more food and things like that. But if you get better technology, you become more efficient, you produce new things, and you just have a takeoff, like South Korea. We also saw this as well. It's just absolutely remarkable there. China. Let's talk about China for a moment. If we went back to our little chart, 1978. That's when Deng Xiaoping took over and changed the direction of policy in China. 800 million people in desperate poverty. Almost 1 billion people, 84% of the population. And there's this sort of ironic quote by this book by an American development economist. 1976, Mao single-handedly changed the face of the world by passing away. Because it was his policies, as Larry had pointed out, that just were leading nowhere. 3% growth. When the history of the late 20th century is written, Mao and Deng Xiaoping, that was a huge transformation. And this gentleman was not responsible for everything, but he led it and allowed it to happen and encouraged it. So he changed the world. This is a special economic zone in 1981 on the coast of China. One of the first that was designated as an area, a free trade zone, as UAE has in many cases. How do you think this looks like today? Oh, exactly. Just like here, a little more trees, because they don't have the desert there. Once again, this is in the space of 30 years. That's absolutely remarkable and stunning. And it wasn't just Deng Xiaoping. Later leaders, this gets exactly what Professor Razin Saleh was talking about. This Zhu Rongji, average tariff, 60%. Actually, even in the 80s, the problem wasn't the tariffs. It was the fact that they just banned trade companies and what have you. But they lifted that, they started bringing the tariffs down in the early 1990s, and trade explodes. That was the regime Razin was talking about that we no longer have. And that's what I'm going to be getting to. This is Shanghai, 1980 versus today. The only thing that remains, look at this clock tower right here, across the river. They didn't take that down, but they took just about everything else down. And of course, the city's just blossomed. And I think it was you who pointed out yesterday an amazing statistic, the number of foreigners in China. Okay, it used to be everyone would go to Shanghai, a great city, interesting to see. No one's going anymore because under President Xi, things have really changed in a different direction. We'll get to that a little bit later. India, something called the license Raj. I think Larry White talked about it. Here are the books that would come out once or twice a year that were bestsellers because you had to get a copy of this book to figure out what licenses are going to be up for availability to import. You couldn't import unless you had a license. And of course, you had to find one, say, oh, I want this one here, and then go bribe some customs official to get the license. And what happened? 1991, as Larry mentioned, there was a set of economists. So one question I've always been curious about is, how do countries change their policy? It takes people, it takes individuals, it takes leadership. And often it takes economists and economic advice. And so these three, Manmohan Singh was the finance minister. He was an Oxford PhD in economics, who wrote his dissertation on how India could become an exporter. And he was lucky enough to get appointed finance minister, and his team said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get India trading and get rid of the license Raj. Montek Singh Ahluwalia had another Oxford DPhil in economics, who had long thought in the Indian bureaucracy we needed change. He was the finance secretary. And I've been lucky enough to get to know him a bit. He has a memoir called Backstage, The Story Behind India's High Growth Years. He just talks about what it's like to work in the Indian bureaucracy to try to bring about change. His whole life, he was trying to bring about change, and actually had this opportunity in 1991 to do so. And so India's tariffs, the maximum rate from 150%. So you needed a license, and then you had to pay a tax of 150% on some goods, bring these right down in the early 1990s. When you reduce those taxes on trade, what happens? Trade explodes. So it used to be that this is just exports and imports, so it's about 10%. Trade is about 10% of GDP in India. And then early 1990s, boom, it goes up to 50%. So India becomes part of the global economy. China becomes part of the global economy. Vietnam becomes part of the global economy. Latin America becomes more part of the global economy, all in the space of these few years. Mumbai in 1975, not quite the miracle of South Korea, but a lot better. More lights, better nutrition, but more widely available food, rising wages, higher living standards. And just as President Xi has taken China back in some sense, now there's movements to move India back and close it up. So here's the Minister of Home Affairs saying, oh, if people would just spend their money on domestic goods, not buy these imports, it would help improve the economy. Anytime someone says something like that, alarm bells should ring off in your head. If we just focus the economy domestically rather than internationally, we'll do better. Not quite so sure about that. So here's per capita income in South Asia. And what's interesting here is look at Bangladesh, which used to be extremely poor, was extremely poor, has been extremely poor. Now it's overtaken some of these others. So Bangladesh also opened up. If you go in the United States and you look at where your garments made, it used to be China, not so much anymore. Exactly, yes, that's right, yeah. 10 years ago, you'd never see anything made in Bangladesh in the United States. Now you see a lot of garments made in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is richer than India on a per capita basis. There's some debate about the statistics, but just the mere fact that they're in the same ballpark, that's pretty shocking, that's pretty amazing. And so here's Indonesia. Here's Jakarta in 1971. Here it is today. Once again, they're already done reasonably well, so not so much big changes. What is this? Pardon me? Abu Dhabi. Not too long ago. Oh, it's Dubai? Okay, I haven't visited, I just got these off the internet. There it is today. Here's, I think this is also Dubai. There it is today. There's a miracle going on right here. Has been going on over the past 20 or 30 years or so. I think in the 1960s. I think the first ones are from the 1960s. Morocco. I have to say something about Morocco. Two trade reforms, one in the mid-1980s, one in the early 2000s. One was reducing tariffs and getting rid of quantitative restrictions. The other was joining the European Union, not directly, but as a partnership. And trade as a share of GDP, exports go way up. If your exports are bigger, you can afford more imports. And so that would be good. And that's why we saw Morocco, since the mid-80s, has performed much better than what alternative path would have been for that country. So people from, those of you from Morocco, have you ever heard of this man? No? Well, when you go home, look him up. Because if you want to say, how has our economy done so much better? As I said, it takes individual policymakers and leadership. He was one of the people that sort of pushed for trade reforms in Morocco. Israel, too. Two stages of reform. One is in the early 1960s. eliminating quantitative import restrictions, trying to promote exports. Israel got a boost from that. There's another one in the 1980s with stabilization, reducing tariffs. And once again, who are the intellectuals behind pushing this? Research director at the Bank of Israel was one of the people sort of pushing for a more open Israeli economy. Getting rid of this idea of a national self-sufficiency in Israel is blossomed too under those sorts of policies. Okay, every country has its own story. Every country has its own mix of policies and people. But here's how it has transformed the world in historic ways. 1800, world income distribution. What do we see? First of all, here's the poverty line. Basically, everyone is poor by modern standards. Who's out here? Well, 1800, the Industrial Revolution was just starting. So it's maybe the Netherlands, maybe England, and a few other countries, and some people in those countries still highly unequal, but very few people had high standard of living in 1800. Pardon me? Certainly, the elites, yeah. So it's a very small fraction of things. But what does the Industrial Revolution do? By mechanizing things, it makes things cheaper, creates higher wages, cheaper goods, and all of a sudden we have Western Europe, the United States, and other countries. But notice the world in 1975, as late as 1975, it's a bimodal world. Remember we said there's the first world, and then there's the second and the third world. And they were separate. And here you have Western Europe and North America, and a few other places, but basically everyone else still poor. The Industrial Revolution hadn't hit. They're isolated, didn't trade a lot, and this is the way the world was. It was a world of rich and poor. So what happens when China and India and all these countries open up? We move things. Notice we're moving this distribution to the right, but it's very skewed. So how does this look like in 2015? Whoops. We'll get there in just a moment. But just to say, this is an article in one of the leading economic journals in the United States, Divergence Big Time. It's saying, what's happening to the world economy? Divergence. Rich are getting richer, the poor are just sort of stagnant. And so we got this ever widening divide, and so many people were worried about this. How do we deal with this? Is it foreign aid? What are we going to do about it? But here we can see what happens in 2015, is we've moved the whole distribution of world income above the international poverty line. And once again, this is 75 to 2015, so it's not too many years and not too long ago that this happened. This is over a century. This is a century and a half. So things have just changed that dramatically, and what you see is that here you have these advanced countries growing, and these ones sort of not moving so much, but then once again, starting in 1980 or so, they start moving up with the start of markets and open trade, and they start catching up and converging. Here's the global income distribution. 1988, it's once again a little bit bimodal, two humps. So we could say we've gone from camel world to dromedary world, or is it the other way around? I can't remember. Which one has two humps? Camel. And what has one hump? Oh, okay, so we've gone from camel world to camel world. Okay, so now, you look, we just have is one hump. Yes?
Asian camels have two humps, whereas like African and Middle Eastern camels have one. So maybe that's also a sign that the world is moving.
Say that again. I got to internalize this. What has two humps?
Like, Mongolian and Chinese
Yes.
camels, they have two humps. And then Middle Eastern camels have one hump, and African camels as well. So maybe that's also...
So it's Eastern. Okay. So we're becoming more Middle Eastern and African in terms of one humps. There we go. Does the term dromedary, is that used? No? Okay. Anyway. Global inequality. It's going back to before 1850. The world more and more unequal, more and more unequal. Either you have the Industrial Revolution or you don't. Rich are getting richer, poor are just not getting poorer, but just not catching up as much. But once again, since late 1980s, early 1990s, and today, so when people say, oh, the world's much more unequal, there's a lot of inequality, you have to make the distinction, are we talking within countries or between countries? Because internationally, inequality is going down. because China, Dubai, so many places have done so much better. Here is the share of the world population living in absolute poverty, going back to 1820. Once again, before in the past, 70, 80, 90% of the world population in poverty, and then early 20th century it starts coming down, and since 1980 it's gone way down. So once again, this is just a dramatic transformation in the world we have today. Here it is in terms of total numbers. So that thing about Mao, what is the red here? This is East Asia and the Pacific. This is Japan, Korea, China, all these other countries. Hundreds of millions of people being brought out of poverty.
And then the population also grows from year to year.
Exactly, we'll see that too. So even though the population is growing, the number of poor people is shrinking. And what about South Asia? That's India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, others. It's shrunk, but not. There's still room to make some progress. What region of the world is there the stubborn? Africa. Okay, it's been very difficult to reduce poverty in Africa. What is the least globalized continent in the world? Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So they need some more globalization in Africa. They need to be part of the world economy to generate the incomes that will alleviate poverty, give them better nutrition, better health care, better education, and things of that sort.
What's the problem?
We'll get to that in just a moment. Here's just, once again, a visual graphic to see, once again, how the world has changed over the past 30 years. Here's the number of people living in world poverty in 1993. Here it is in 2013. And I'd love to update this to 2023 because there's been even more progress made. Just look at that again. Okay, a lot of it is China. Look at how China shrinks. Some of it is India. India's shrinking. But it's also Indonesia, Bangladesh, a few others. And once again, the yellow here, Africa, whoops. Africa, not so much progress. A lot of progress in Brazil and elsewhere. So that's just that reduction in poverty. So the share of the world population in extreme poverty since 1990, from about 30% down to 10%, it's not just China. It's other countries as well. Sometimes these dismissive comments, oh, poverty's gone down, it's just China. No, it's not just China, it's other countries as well. Even Nigeria and a bunch of other countries have made progress in reducing poverty because growth has picked up. Why? Yes, sorry.
2 quarters we showed Nigeria increased poverty.
Let's see. That's true. That's the number of people, yes, but the poverty rate has gone down. Population's gotten bigger. The Economist magazine. If you don't read The Economist, I highly recommend it. It's just one news source. You know, you're inundated with so many news sources, but it's always interesting. Towards the end of poverty, they say, what's going on? Most of the credit is not going to foreign aid or the UN or what have you. It goes to capitalism and free trade, for they enabled economies to grow, and is growth principally that has eased destitution. So free trade policies made a contribution by raising incomes, as we said yesterday. Who's learned this lesson? Well, I showed you Taylor Swift. She's American, so I've got to diversify a little bit in terms of gender and locations. Let's go to a male from Ireland. He used to believe, everyone knows Bono, I presume? Okay, he used to believe this world inequality is horrible. We have to do something about it. We have to transfer resources from the rich to the poor. I thought redistributed resources could solve every problem. Now I know that's not true. The off-ramp to extreme poverty is UGG commerce. It's entrepreneurial capitalism. Why did he say UGG?
It's hard to say.
Why is it hard to say?
He feels it isn't ethical. That's how he thought it was.
Exactly. For some people, they just think capitalism. It's a bad word. Commerce. UGG. He's a progressive. You know, he's hip. He doesn't talk about commerce and free trade and stuff like that, but he's...
Also makes a lot of money.
Yeah, he does, exactly, yes. He does. So here's where he says this in an interview. He says the off-ramp is poverty. I spent a lot of time in countries all over Africa, and they're like, we wouldn't mind a little more globalization, actually. Because the people he used to hang out with, they'd think, oh, globalization's bad because it leads to more inequality. Globalization exacerbates poverty. I hope I should have showed you that it's exactly the opposite, but that's a widely held view. And he's saying in Africa they wouldn't mind more globalization, as I said, this is the least globalized region. And so my students, maybe you do this too, come up with memes. You know what memes are? Okay. Do you create your own memes? There are apps. Apparently we can do this quickly. I have to learn this at some point. Here's the meme they came up with. Here's someone saying, oh, you don't need more globalization. Actually, we wouldn't mind a little more globalization. Okay? It would help us out. Because globalization is more popular than you would think. Once again, many Dartmouth students will say, it's a bad thing, but when you just do surveys, a lot of academic economists look at the backlash against globalization. People don't like it, so they're pushing back by electing leaders. But if you just do surveys, has globalization been good or bad for your country? First of all, very few people think it's bad, except in France. Okay, the French don't like it so much. 27% of people in France don't like globalization. It gets to the sort of the values and the cultural things we were talking about before. But most of the rest of the world, we're talking 50, 60%. Yes, it's been good. So I think sometimes we underrate how popular and how this is. So this has been called the neoliberal era. And I put neoliberal in quotation marks because it's usually a bad word. If it's neoliberal, it's bad. Okay? It's been a fantastic period for the world as a whole. First of all, it's historically unique. You've heard the Chinese phrase, may you live in interesting times. I lived through these times and I didn't notice. Every day, every year, things are happening, but it doesn't make an impression. But when you look back, you say, my God, where did we start and where did we end up? The world is transformed. So this is historically, people are going to be writing about this period for a long time. Impressive global growth, convergence, poverty reduction. You can see it right here in UAE, in terms of the new buildings. There's always a catch. There's always a but. But it depended to some extent on benign geopolitics. What does that mean? Sort of the Roman Empire. There wasn't any contestation among big powers. China wanted to get rich. They weren't worried about expansion. They wanted to open up their market. Russia just wanted to stabilize and become normal. And what has changed?
China wants to rule.
China maybe wants to rule, and Russia wants to destabilize. They haven't been able to stabilize so much themselves, so they want to destabilize others. And Putin wants to recreate the old Soviet Union. So here's period 4, this huge expansion in world trade. And that's the period I think is over, unfortunately. Yeah.
So in period 4, there was like huge peak, very rapid peak for gas.
That's your point. That's the oil shock. The oil shock, this is 1974, 75, 73.
Increased globalization?
It increased the measure of trade because, once again, if the oil price quadruples, can you say, okay, I'm just going to cut my consumption of oil by half. It's too expensive. Is that what countries did? No. You still got to heat your home. You still want to run your car. You got to pay more. So the question is, if you're going to import more, the cost of your imports went up, what has to happen? Somehow you've got to pay for that somehow. You've got to export more. So the value and volume of world trade went up, even though that was a negative shock in some sense to the global economy. Yeah.
So following up on that point, can we say that global trade increases as prices increase?
No, not necessarily. No. That's not it. Because once again, trade may increase with prices falling because of technology reducing costs. That'll also increase trade. So oil is a very special commodity where it's hard to substitute away from it in the short run. But most other goods you can. So that would reduce trade if it was some of those other goods. Yes?
I have like almost 3-part question, but not that long.
Okay.
First, I want to know, just so that I can simplify it, all of the graphs are not show that if you reduce trade barriers, trade increases in GDP, and it's all positive.
Right.
So my question is simply, why don't people just completely remove trade barriers for good? And why wouldn't that be?
Great point. The short answer would be domestic interests and domestic politics. Because when you're reducing trade barriers, you're giving something to some people, but you're taking away something that is protecting others.
So protectionism, kind of.
Yes, so there are going to be domestic producers that are going to say, don't do that. It's going to hurt us, we're going to lose jobs. And yes, there are sectors that are going to contract. It's always a messy process, but there are other sectors that are going to do well.
And also I wanted to say, with the pictures that you showed of like Korea, Mumbai, and places like that, most of it showed that they were poverty-struck countries, and then they transformed into these metropolitan cities almost. So what do you think for cities that are already established, such as Abu Dhabi and Dubai and stuff like that, looking forward, do they even need to be thinking about trade and trying to increase trade if they're already, like, the same way you said yesterday, if you reach a certain point, there's no more innovation.
Right, yep.
So what now?
I'll say something about that in just a moment. Yep.
And last
Yep.
part. Okay, yeah, it's kind of the same, so I just...
Okay, so let's continue. So we have this huge run-up between, up until about 2008 or so. What's happened since? We're in a new period, period 5. It's not going up nearly as much, maybe even going down a bit, depending on how you measure it. And so we've hit what we call an inflection point. Okay, we're not on this upward escalator anymore, we've changed. So the world's changed over the past 10, 15 years or so. Yeah.
Would you say that this change might be related to the stopping innovation a little bit? They might decrease the going up because there was a huge change in technology in those years. There was a huge innovation, and now from what I understand, there's kind of a peak, and now it's really hard to get over that peak, to create things that are new. Just people recreate things that already exist, and maybe that could be a reason for increasing.
Yeah, so certainly what you have here is the internet, you have personal computers and computing, semiconductors and everything. Now, of course, we have AI coming. That's going to be very disruptive, potentially a big boost. We don't know yet. We'll have to see. Or perhaps, yep. So you're right. So we had a lot of innovations that are driving this too, and it's not clear what the innovations are today that are going to be driving things. We're shifting from gas-powered cars to EVs. But that's not going to, give a big boost to anything. It's just the same thing, only produced in a different way. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. But you're absolutely right. So here, getting to both of these points, something happened in 2008. That's 2008. That's the peak. Of course, we had the financial crisis. It goes down, but then it comes right back up, and then it starts declining. So what's gone on since then? A whole bunch of things. So first of all, as I was just mentioning, diminishing returns to one-off events. So India takes its maximum tariff from 150% to 20%. Did it get a big boon from that? Yes. Okay, it's going to take its 20% tariff down to 5%. Is it going to get a big boom from that? Well, you've already done the big stuff, so you can only reduce it so much. You can't go less than 0. Okay, so you reduce all these trade costs. First of all, you have the Airbus Beluga. Okay, do you make one that's twice the size? Stalled trade reforms. First of all, you bring those tariffs down, but then you don't, once again, you can't go lower than 0, and in fact, you don't even want to move it anymore, and some countries are moving back. So that's stalled. Global value chains, the spread of supply networks, that's sort of stalled out. So first of all, there was a net, so that it wasn't going to go up forever, right? It's not going to go up and up and up forever, so it's going to turn at some point, and so naturally, there may have been some turning point. But also, there are other things going on, okay? A lot of things. China needed to turn inward. So this gets back to Razin Saleh in China. President Xi has changed policies, and he's not Deng Xiaoping. He wants indigenous technological development. He doesn't want trade as much. So he's focusing inward. India too under Modi. The US and China had a trade war, so delinking the economies. The pandemic, it negatively affected trade. We came right back, but it affected attitudes towards trade. Oh, we found out we're really dependent on masks and personal protective. Maybe we should produce that at home. So it got people focused more on things at home. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a deglobalizing event to some extent. And also changing attitudes. Oh, if we can't trust Russia and Ukraine, their ability to send us wheat, well, where are we going to get our wheat? We have to produce it at home. In the Arab world, what's the political significance of the price of wheat? and bread.
It caused like a civil war, so uprising.
Exactly. It's hugely destabilizing, huge issue. So then you do what Saudi Arabia did, start growing wheat in the desert. Okay, because hey, we can't trust world supply anymore. So it gets countries moving in a different direction. National security concerns, I raised this last time. Semiconductors, oops, all of our semiconductors are coming from Taiwan or South Korea. Well, it only takes one missile from that lunatic up in North Korea to wipe out parts of South Korea, and then all it takes is China doing something in Taiwan, and we don't have semiconductors. We got to think about where we're getting these things. So we have all these things. Let's just go through them quickly. So we've entered what the economists call globalization. Okay, it's that slowing of global integration. Yeah, sorry.
If I could just add to that, you might call it increase for whatever reason of nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And again, on that list, for some reason, no one adds what's happening in the United States, because the same thing is there. Donald Trump ran for president saying, "Make America great again," and tariffs, more growth of government on both parties. The growth in government, has been huge within the United States. So I'd say globally, more internal national politicization, and that goes the opposite direction of what we want.
Exactly. Yep. And he thought other countries are taking advantage of us. So this globalization hasn't worked out so well for us. So they're taking our jobs.
Blame other people.
Blame other countries. Yep. So goodbye globalization, the dangerous lure of self-sufficiency. It's not the end of globalization, but it's a change from the recent past. So these global value chains, they had been from the World Bank. Once again, they peaked around 2008. And multinationals and others are not sort of saying, let's spread our production networks across more and more countries. It's saying, let's consolidate them a little bit. Here's the pandemic. Is this the end of globalization? No. Is it a good thing for globalization? No, not really. But it's not. So here's the impact of trade. So this is getting to Tyler's point. Very slow recovery from the financial crisis. It took 2 years for world trade to get back where it was. Big negative shock. The pandemic, basically within 10 months, boom, we're back to where we were. So it was a negative shock, but we came back from it. Here's China. China used to export about 35% of GDP, and it's fallen down to less than 20%. So China sort of moved inward too. Through various things that Razin was talking about yesterday. The state strikes back, the end of economic reform in China. So they used to be liberalizing, moving in a more market direction. Now they're moving in a more state-controlled direction. Post-virus strategy, China looks inward. So that China's moved inward. Now The Economist is just a week or so ago, big questions about whether China is going to be doing well under this new strategy of looking inward and what have you. Even independent of what is going on with President Xi is questions raised by the Trump administration and the United States more generally, continued by the Biden administration. Is China a fair trader? If they have all these state-run enterprises that are getting subsidies, how can they compete? Is that fair for them to compete against U.S. firms that aren't subsidized, where we have a market economy? And so this is going back a while, but there have been long-standing concerns about the integration of the U.S. and China, two very different models. Whoops. Let's see. And so the big question is, what's the world going to look like when China and the U.S. don't get along? Because we saw with the Roman Empire, and we saw after 1989, we have sort of this one world with the WTO, and now we're fragmenting. Things are different. So the world has changed since 2008 for various reasons. Geopolitics is now back, and it dominates the economics in some sense. Security more than efficiency, because of the pandemic, because of national security and semiconductors, what have you. So the U.S. has changed very much. Europe has changed very much, and we're in a different world. So there's all these new phrases in the United States. Decoupling. What does decoupling mean? Have you heard of that phrase coming from the U.S.? What does it mean in the U.S. context?
Separation from the economic of the West and China.
Exactly. Separate from China. So we used to be very well integrated. Now let's go the opposite way. Okay, let's decouple. We can't trust them. They steal our technology. We aren't playing by the same rules and what have you. Friend shoring. So there used to be this term offshoring. You want to offshore production because it's more efficient to do it in other countries. Well, now you still might want to do that, but you do it with friends. So you pick the countries that you have good alliances with and you offshore to them, but you don't do it with China, don't do it with Russia and what have you. Just in time to just in case. This is the business attitude. What does just in time mean? You don't maintain inventories. If you need something, you bring it in just in time. McDonald's, Toyota did this too. Now, just in case, now we want to maintain inventories close to home because just in case our supply lines are cut or there's some shock. So that's changes things too. Here's decoupling. The U.S. Share of imports coming from China has gone down. This is interesting. This is Honda. Honda is thinking about, is it possible to make a car with zero China content? It's really hard. All the components, nothing's coming from China, but the mere fact they're thinking about it as a potential business strategy, that's impressive. Apple is now thinking, they were 100% in China. All the iPhones, all the iPads, all the iPods, 100% in China. And they're saying, okay, we got to diversify. We got to go to India. We got to go to Mexico. We got to get out of China. Here's their strategy to 2024. They're going to go from 100% to 90%. In other words, it's really hard because the advantages of doing business in China are great.
Does any country see this as an opportunity to start developing different equipment? Because that seems like an opportunity for a country. If there's a country that is capable of creating different compartments or parts for these kind of things, I would take this chance and
Yes.
try to develop these things, especially if the country has the possibility to do that.
I can think of two countries right off the bat which are saying, if Apple wants to get out of China, we're here. What countries might they be? India? Okay, 3 countries. Didn't come to mind, but potentially, yep. Pardon me? South Korea, they're high cost. Pardon me? Vietnam, I was thinking Vietnam and Mexico. Yeah, they're independent, but Vietnam, really low labor costs, a large population. Mexico, right next door. So all these other countries too, but those are the 2 countries that are sort of well positioned to say, we should be attracting investment.
Doug, are you going to have terms of trade up there? Do you have a slide on that?
Nope.
Because one of the pushbacks on this whole slow globalization is that the terms of trade, from the U.S. perspective, we're leaving China as fast as we possibly can. And we're getting better deals in Vietnam, better deals in Indonesia, better deals in Sri Lanka, better deals in Bangladesh. And Mexico's our largest trading partner.
Mm-hmm.
They passed China by quite a bit. So we're not, our inflation's coming off because that transition is part of the plan. That's one of the reasons why it's coming off.
Mm-hmm.
And also the Fed isn't being quite as aggressive at money printing
Yep.
these days. But that's a very key thing. So the whole idea that, the analogies to the Great Depression or the fall of the Roman Empire, which you also don't agree with, Chloe, I understand that. I would just point out that you got to look at the terms of trade and what countries are actually importing it. And China's a pretty damn expensive place to do business when you figure everything in.
Yeah.
Companies are figuring that out.
There's a lot of stuff that would be naturally happening. It's not just the policies, its costs have gone up in China. So there would have been this migration of industries to Vietnam and Bangladesh and elsewhere as well. But the geopolitics is giving an added push, but it's all moving in the same direction. And so I don't disagree with anything you've just said. Question in the back? Let me just wrap up and then we'll take a few questions because we're just about there. But the point is here, it's sort of hard to do initially. Okay, so this is not going all the way down. It's not destruction of globalization, but the level of integration is sort of topped off, and now the question is it continue to go down, or does it just flatten out? If we look 20 years ahead, are we going to be here? Are we going to be down here? Who knows? But here's sort of where we were. Global integration, at least in the US, there was painful domestic disruptions. Okay, it was a shock to some of our industries. It's a lot of adjustment. But when you disintegrate too, It's the same thing. And you're losing the gains. So if there's gains from integration, there's cost to disintegration. And to the extent the world becomes more politically fragmented and we become more economically fragmented, once again, all those benefits that we've seen become much more difficult. So there are a bunch of studies out there about what happens if the world economy fragments. What's the cost? These are models, they're simulations, so you have to take everything with a grain of salt. But we're talking about losing a percentage of world GDP, maybe 6% of world GDP. That's all prospective because we'll continue to grow, but just not at the same path before. That gets good. Things are difficult. So, what do you don't want to Dubai, UAE shouldn't be thinking about moving inward. But you have to think about what's next. So you built all these beautiful buildings. What's next? It is a difficult question. There's a WTO effects of decoupling. Nothing's positive for the world economy, but you can take your pick about who's our winners and losers. Here's the problem: protectionist measures are going up, so it gets to this nationalism point, the revival of protectionism. Just another compounding thing: the World Trade Organization, which is the coming from the GATT, it was supposed to sort of oversee the rules and adjudicate disputes. It's sort of not working well because of the U.S., China, and a bunch of other countries. So dispute settlement system is not working basically for reasons we can get into. And so that means when countries fight trade wars, there's no impartial, objective decision that can clean things up. Let's see but even here, some in the United States saying the WTO ought to be abolished, and so that we should just pull out. So we used to have what was known as a rules-based system. Now it's a power-based system. So you probably know that big countries can push little countries around. What does China do? When Norway gave the a Nobel Prize to a dissident from China, they stopped buying salmon from Norway. So they're using politics to trade to make their political views known. So we're running out of time. Financial Times just saying, for all the discontents that hyperglobalization, I think that this period will be seen as the golden age of peace and prosperity. The world may soon discover that globalization is the worst possible system apart from all the alternatives. And that's sort of where we are. So,
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Another question, sorry.